Hi everyone, welcome to the third edition of Edge Talks, and I'm your host Praveen Khangta. Elementary education in India is free and compulsory, yet nearly half of our children go to private schools in India. And these aren't the Delhi public schools of the world. These are what you would call low-cost schools, where 70% of students pay actually less than 1,000 rupees a month. They are expanding rapidly in rural areas and some of the poorer states like Rajasthan and Uttar Pradesh. COVID-19 has had a tremendous impact on school education, more so on the private schools, which depend on fees for their survival. Today, to talk about the private school sector in India and the impact COVID has had on them, I'm joined by my colleague Rahul Ahluwalia. Rahul is Associate Director, Governance at Central Scare Foundation, and he leads both the public and the private school governance in India. Prior to joining CSF, he was at Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and before that at Niti Aayog. In both these organizations and institutions, he was involved in identifying ways to improve governance in India. Welcome, Rahul.
Thanks, Praveen. Great to be here.
You know, this is almost like a feel-good story, right? Like poor, aspirational people actually voting with their feet and choosing a school of their own. But we know the reality is actually more nuanced than that.
Yes, it is.
Surveys after survey have told us that even with the increase in privatization, the outcomes that the schools are producing or the school system is producing hasn't improved a bit, right?
Absolutely.
So there's some sort of a market failure happening. Talk a little bit about, I think, this market failure that, even with parents choosing a particular private school.
So a couple of qualifications there, right? Like I think one is that at a very raw sort of unadjusted kind of level, outcomes in all private schools, including low-cost private schools, are better than those in government schools. I think really where this conversation is, there's been a lot of research on this, right? And where this conversation has gotten a lot more nuanced is that if you adjust for the background of the people, right, generally these people will be slightly better off than the worst of people, which are in the government school system. And that seems to be driving a lot of this difference. If you do a pure lottery, right, to people who are going to the government school system, if they move to a sort of slightly better private schools, their outcomes improve a little bit, but not very much, right? So it's marginal. And to me, I think really more than anything else, it's the long-term trend, right? Like the long-term trend in the private school system, if you look at ASA results going back 10, 15 years, it's largely stagnant, right? The outcomes have not been improving, right? And typically when you look at how the private sector does, right, these things actually shift quite a bit, right? Like, so quality either improves or prices in real terms tend to drop. That's because competition is constantly driving improvement, right? In a typical private sector market, right? And I think what that tells us, and this is something actually researchers have known for a long time, right, is that education is not a typical private sector market, right? And the main part of that is that this outcome that we care about, right, learning outcomes, what we call how kids, whether kids are attaining the skills that they want to or not, these are not very visible to parents, right? Especially not to parents who would be sending their kids to a budget private school, let's say, right? And in particular, they are not able to compare that outcome or their kid's outcome with the outcome of their kid in, say, what if my kid was in some other school, right? You can't do that because your kid is in the school that they're in, right? So if absent that comparison, what happens really is that parents don't have a way of comparing schools, right? And when you don't have a way of comparing schools, schools will tend to compete around the things that you can see, right, that their customer can see. And that's why schools will compete around things like, how is my school building looking? How much homework am I giving to my kid? What uniforms are kids wearing? What do they think of as discipline? So stuff that parents can touch and experience and feel. And I think it's this, and economists call this problem information asymmetry, right? That schools have much more information about the quality of education they're providing than parents. In this kind of situation, it's quite expected actually to see this fact, right? So this is I think the number one quote unquote market failure in education, that parents cannot observe learning quality. So the interesting thing is actually that there is some very good evidence showing that fixing the information asymmetry issue is actually very, very useful in terms of improving learning outcomes, right? So very high quality research coming from Jishnu Das and the LEAPS program, right, at World Bank and Harvard, I believe. They did their research in Punjab, where they showed, that if you just test children in private schools and create a report card at the level of the school, right, and then publish that report card both to schools and to parents, right, then this results in private schools then competing around improving those learning outcomes, right? And I think those studies are actually fantastic. So Farzana Afridi at the Indian Statistical Institute did a very, very similar study in Rajasthan and had very similar results, right? So these are both very high quality sets of studies, very good evidence to show that I think this is something that we should definitely be trying to do, right? And I think Jishnu's work in particular, so they extended that. I haven't seen the final published paper, but I've heard him talk about this, right? Is that it actually gives you a great deal of understanding around why outcomes are more important rather than dictating the inputs, right? Like if you dictate inputs, the experts will typically tell you, oh, you have to drop pupil teacher ratios, and that's the only way to get improvements. What these guys found was that they actually increased pupil teacher ratios, not to crazy extents, but they increased them in the schools that started doing better after these results were announced, right? But what they did was they hired teachers who were much more monitorable by the school owners, right? So in the sense that they would hire somebody who's much closer to their family or whatever, so that they could actually be more certain that the teacher was putting in more effort on actually teaching, right? And these are the kinds of ways in which we can never predict, right? Like what is it that will actually improve outcomes for kids, right? Which is why we shouldn't be trying to dictate that relationship. We should just be trying to say, let's measure the outcome, let's make that outcome known to everybody, all the stakeholders, whether it's school principals, school owners, parents, right? Local government schools. And then you let that system optimize, because nobody knows the context, nobody knows the constraints better than that local system, right? As an aside, this may also be true on the government school side, but the complications there are much, much higher, right? So on the private school side, at least, this works very well. So now how does this translate into what can we do, right? I think, and here I think the NEP I'm actually quite impressed by as a document, right? I think it calls for key stage assessments, right? It calls for those key stage assessments to be carried out independently and at grades 3, 5, 8, and for those results to be declared at the school level more generally. So I think just following that prescription is actually fantastic.